Hello and welcome to our webinar on Polyvagal Theory and Lawyers, Cultivating Support for Ethical Decision-Making, presented by Stacey Best, LCL's Executive Director, and Dr. Tracy Myers, one of LCL's clinicians. For more of a foundation on the polyvagal theory, please visit our digital website to watch Dr. Myers' presentation from February of this year, entitled What is Polyvagal Theory? Applications for Navigating Stress and Resilience in the Legal Profession. I'm going to introduce our speakers shortly. I am Amy Levine, Director of Programs and Volunteers. I'm going to be your host for today. Few housekeeping notes. We do love engagement. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A or chat features, and we will do our best to address them. And now I would like to introduce my esteemed colleagues. Attorney Stacey Best, a distinguished legal professional with nearly 2 decades of experience at the Massachusetts Board of Bar Overseers and the Office of Bar Counsel, where she investigated alleged violations of the rules of professional conduct and litigated disciplinary matters. Attorney Best began her legal career in the trial division of the Committee for Public Counsel Services and has served as a clinical instructor at the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School. She also has taught at Boston Law School, her alma mater, and currently teaches at Suffolk University Law School. Her outstanding contributions to the legal community have been recognized with numerous honors, including the Honorable David S. Nelson Public Interest Law Award from BC Law and the Protector of Justice Award from the Massachusetts Academy of Trial Attorneys, among other accolades. Next, Dr. Tracy Myers is a licensed clinical psychologist with more than 25 years of experience in neuropsychology assessment and psychotherapy. Prior to joining Lawyers Concern for Lawyers in 2020, she spent 17 years with the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, where she served as both a clinical neuropsychologist and director of behavioral intervention services. In addition to her clinical experience, Dr. Myers is a certified yoga therapist, advanced yoga teacher, and mindfulness instructor. She has written extensively on integrative medicine and positive behavioral support, and is the author of Yin Yoga Therapy and Mental Health. Dr. Myers also serves on the board of the Mindfulness and Law Society, where she supports the promotion of well-being in the legal profession. And now I am going to hand it off to Stacey.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you all for being here. I have to say, I am very excited to be having this conversation with you and with Tracy, Dr. Myers. I think one of the things that we want you to have as a takeaway is that this is a very interdisciplinary approach to lawyering and to lawyer well-being. There are many challenges that we as lawyers face where we received academic training, we received training on the how to do, but there's often the sort of duck feet under the water that's going on for many of us as we're engaged in that practice. And the ideas that we are pursuing here have to do with combining the neuropsychology of what's happening in our minds and in our bodies with the ethical practice and sort of understanding that there's a structural reason for doing things in a certain way. And we hope that this will enhance your lives, enhance your practice, and enhance your well-being. We do have a slide deck that Tracy is going to begin sharing as we go through. And so let's jump right in. So as I just got through saying, so the ethical rules underpin all of what we do as lawyers, even though many of us have not given thought to them since law school. But if you were to read the preamble to the rules of professional conduct, it describes us as public citizens and talks about our duty to the administration of justice, and that what we also recognize in why we are public citizens and in carrying out our duty to the administration of justice, we realize that we are facing stressful circumstances, and some of you may have heard the term or heard me use the term VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous circumstances that can impact how we see the events unfolding in front of us and stress us out. And we need to be able to manage that stress so that we have the space in our minds to make good decisions. So challenging or oh, sorry. As I said, the rules of professional conduct as pertains to 8.4D gives us the ethical in terms of enforcement obligation to avoid conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. When we meet our clients often, we are dealing with relationship bonds, we are dealing with their identity, we are dealing with our own identity, we are dealing with their financial well-being, and we are dealing with our financial well-being. And so notice the bidirectional nature of the interactions and therefore the greater need to be able to manage ourselves in that process. Because failing to take care when we are in the position of responsibility will impact client relationships, it will impact client outcomes, and certainly can impact the orderly resolution of matters, as well as your own business interests and your own sort of professional interests in terms of maintaining a good reputation within the legal community. And at the heart of what we do in almost every aspect of these relationships is challenging communications. And we have an ethical obligation to keep clients reasonably informed, which means that those need to be prompt. They need to be related to the client's objectives, and we need to be complying with reasonable requests. But at times when the relationship is difficult, we don't do what is prompt. We don't respond to what might be reasonable requests because we are having a reactive response. And that's sort of, if we're thinking back to that first image, that's when we start to get into the yellow and then potentially into the red. And then when we're dealing with clients, we often have to help them find reasonable limits or place reasonable limits and boundaries on the scope of that representation. And then sometimes we're dealing with clients who don't understand or respect boundaries, and that places stress on us as we have this obligation written into our rules that regulate our conduct that says we can't assist a client in criminal or fraudulent conduct. And then another area that is often very stressful is talking about money. Being able to ask for a fee that is commensurate with your skill and experience, being able to collect that fee, being able to collect the retainer, and we may also be feeling other stressful stresses around that representation that further complicate the money matters. And then billing. There are sometimes the issue of our own sort of internal narratives of where we come from, about whether our bills are just and right, and even if they are, if there's a response, how to deal with that response. So there's a lot there. And sort of moving on to other areas, termination of a relationship between a client and a lawyer can be very complicated. It can be complicated because there is a rule violation afoot. It can be complicated because the lawyer is now having issues of cognitive decline. It can be complicated because the lawyer has feelings around the fairness, the justness, the rightness of whether they should be terminated. But if you were to read the rules, these are instances where there is an ethical obligation to terminate the relationship. And so how do we balance our internal reaction with those ethical obligations as we're watching the issue come down the pike? And then I think one of the areas that is the subject of many lawyer jokes has to do with truthful communication to the court. And we as lawyers who have to protect confidentiality struggle between protecting the confidence of the clients and being forthright with the court. Whether we have to correct a misrepresentation, those of us who have ever engaged in criminal practice probably have experienced the circumstance where we had to correct a misrepresentation of a client or a witness and found it very stressful to do that, and then trying to remember all of our ethical duties while we're doing that can be a challenge. And there's the other sort of embedded issue in 3.1 in terms of whether we are using the court's resources appropriately. You can have opposing counsel that is very challenging and can cause a drain on court resources. And so one of the first things we want to think about is where in the process are we experiencing this challenge? What relationship is at play where we need to do the most work? There's the structural piece of information in terms of what are the relevant standards, the rules and regulations that address the issue. And knowing those things is one thing. But almost every rule violation or ethical violation I have observed hasn't been from the product of not knowing the rule. It has been related to having an incapacity to address oneself and deal with the challenges that the lawyer is facing. And so when we're dealing with those stressful situations, undoubtedly, we have our own narratives that come up for us that tell us, and our brains, as Tracy will talk about in a minute, our brains tell us based on our history and our experiences, what is true. But we could be dealing with someone who has an alternative, a different view of what is true, and it could actually be true. Like both could be inaccurate, both could be correct. And that's what this graphic presents. But then what shows up for us when we think someone is wrong, we can almost feel the reactivity in our body. And so then our minds cause us to put labels or diagnose the wrongness of the other person. It can cause us to create physical distance or emotional distance, which is not going to help resolve or solve the problem. It can cause us to try to actually force someone to come to our side of the table, either physically or emotionally, in terms of how we word things. But what if there are other reasons that impact that we can think about to work on that will give us the space to see what someone else is seeing? Maybe not have to accept it as true, but gives us the tools to be able to respond as opposed to react. Tracy is going to talk about some of those. We've picked out a few here, and she's going to talk about several of these, and then we'll continue on from there. Tracy?
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, so if we think about how we make decisions, how we respond, especially to stressful situations, like Stacy was sharing earlier, when we are activated, there's a lot that goes into how we react and respond. And so I'm going to briefly talk about physical, cognitive beliefs and identity, and then really save time for the crux of what we're going to be talking about today, which is the dynamic process of nervous system regulation. So very quickly, right? So all of these things shape how we make decisions, right? And how we respond. Our physical abilities, our energy level. Think about a low energy day versus a high energy day. Our ability to respond to stress, which we'll get into more. Fatigue, our overall health can impact how well we do on the job. Cognitive ability, which is another big topic. We could spend hours talking about each of these, but we're going to go through it really quickly. So cognitive ability, including intellectual capability, right? And think about how important a lawyer's brain is, analytical skills, problem-solving skills, the capacity to process information quickly, judgment and reasoning, adaptability. So an agile mind, right? All these things are key for lawyers to be able to do their jobs. Emotional intelligence, right? Being able to understand and have empathy to be effective, right? To be able to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathically. So our emotional intelligence. And a lot of these, you're going to see a theme with the physical, the intellect, and et cetera, that these are relatively fixed traits. Yes, we can learn some of them, but over time they become pretty crystallized, right? That we have what we have. Just a little bit more about what emotional intelligence, it can include self-awareness, empathy, social skills, conflict resolution. And if we struggle in any of these domains, it can directly impact, right? So lawyers that have less developed emotional intelligence may struggle with conflict resolution, right? Because they tend to get have difficulty with perspective taking, for example. Social skills matters in certain legal professions more than others, right? But if someone has some difficulty in social situations, it's going to be harder to make a deal, to do mediation. Neurodiversity is another, has another impact on how we think, how we perspective take. It can give unique perspectives to lawyers who could have innovative solutions and different viewpoints. Certain neurodiverse traits can help lawyers really pay attention to details with a high level of focus and create certain creative strategies. But also there can be some challenges too. Traditional work environments may not be as effective for someone who is neurodiverse. So these are all ways that a lawyer's decision making can be impacted. And finally, learned beliefs, which can be acquired over time. And we all have them. Sometimes we're aware of our learned beliefs, and sometimes they're under the radar, but they're operating, right? For example, perfectionism. You know, many lawyers struggle with perfectionism, and it's a belief that can go back many, many years around, I have to do it right, something could go wrong. Work-life balance, the idea of work being, you know, the most important thing. These are like these core beliefs that are operating that affect our decision-making, just affect whether we take another case on, for example. External locus of control is a real interesting topic we could spend a lot of time on, but the idea that other people or life outside of me is what controls me. I don't have a lot of control, and that can make lawyers feel very powerless, right? And talking about what's happening in the world today, right? A lot of external feelings around, you know, I can't control what's happening. And finally, resilience, the belief in a lawyer's belief that they can impact and move through setbacks, et cetera. So all of these are things that can be slightly adjusted, tweaked, looked at, but a lot of them are fixed traits, right? And I'm going to throw back to Stacy for a couple other things to consider in terms of what impacts a lawyer's decision making.
Thank you, Tracy. So one of the things that we wanted to be sure to talk about are sort of those identity-based factors that impact not the representation as well as the lawyer and the lawyer's thinking, and understanding what and who they are dealing with. And so as we, one of the things that sort of comes to mind, especially in the space that we are in socially, where we're questioning the work, some of us are questioning the work we've done around diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is really an indication that we do need to understand one another as much as we can, and understand that the way we see things are often learned behaviors. And so I did issues of culture, and realized that that is sort of behavior learned in group socialization. Race is a social construct that has been created to make divisions along physical traits. Ethnicity is another sort of shared experience around culture, religion, and language, meaning that certain words will mean certain things to me, but may mean a different thing to Tracy. And then identity sort of, again, is the all-encompassing memories and experiences that we have. And it really gets into what Tracy was mentioning a moment acknowledged earlier, for some of us, we have this idea that we don't have much power. And some of that comes from sort of the combinations of identity, elements of our identity that are on our next slide here, that where they intersect in ways with our social experience that gives us the narratives that complicate how we feel and deal with things. None of us is any single thing. We're all the product of intersecting identities. And then if we look at the next slide, we see how the social experience can come to influence that identity in a way that greatly contributes to how we lawyer and how we perceive our responsibilities even as lawyers. One of the things, though, again, to remind us of with respect to our ethical obligation is to recognize that we as lawyers, because we understand the system of law, actually have great power. And receiving and understanding that power is sort of what brings us here to think about where we are in our nervous system, in our regulation, and making sure that we're actually engaging in our well-being for the benefit of ourselves, our colleagues, our clients, and the practice, and ultimately society. Tracy?
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. So let's talk about nervous system regulation now, because regulating our nervous system, and I love this idea of it being dynamic, meaning we can influence and we can change over time. It's something that we can do, right? And so as we talked about earlier, things like identity, fixed traits like intelligence, our belief system that can be highly ingrained implicitly and explicitly, even our physical health, right? These are things we don't often have that much control over. And our nervous system gives us this avenue, this doorway into being able to have some control over how we respond to situations. And I love the idea of it being dynamic, meaning that we're not always able to do it at all times, but it's an evolving process and we can begin to work on it. When we asked for feedback prior to the presentation today, we looked at what you all were interested in, and a lot of people were interested in tools to regulate difficult emotions like anxiety and stress. And so I love the idea that we can acquire this over time, and it's an ongoing life journey. So nervous system regulation can be practiced, right? And we're going to talk about some of those today. We're going to do a practice at the end and use that as part of a scenario to really see how we can use it live in vivo in a situation. And so we'll talk about mindfulness, breath work, and some grounding exercises. And also how to even understand why we do these practices. Stacy and I were talking before about how sometimes, if you're told to box breathe and when you're stressed, it can feel condescending or silly, like that's the last thing I want to do, right? But if you know why and what you're doing and how it can influence your nervous system, then, it may be box breathing or it may be another technique, but it begins to make sense why these techniques are actually helpful in the moment. So let's talk. I'm going to do a very quick overview of the polyvagal theory, and please, I put the link in the chat, but please feel free to refer back. In February, I did an hour long just on this overview. There's some science pieces in it, and it can be pretty dense. So I want to just quickly go over it again, and then we'll go from there. So again, if you think about your nervous system, it's like a giant surveillance system, always trying to figure out, is it okay? Are we safe? And it's a complex structure because it involves the brain and then the signals in the body that are happening all the time. Two main parts of the nervous system. We have the CNS, the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, which we'll be focusing on today. And particularly the polyvagal theory, which involves the PNS and how that can affect safety and emotion regulation and the feeling of overall resiliency in the body. So the vagus nerve, so polyvagal theory involves the vagus nerve, the idea that the vagus nerve actually has multiple branches, and we'll go into that in a moment. But the vagus nerve is the main parasympathetic nerve in the body. It's the largest nerve, the longest nerve, cranial nerve 10. And it involves involuntary functions of the heart rate, digestion, and immune system. And think about that. Like those three systems are huge in terms of how we feel and our ability to remain calm or our ability to activate. There are both afferent and efferent nerve fibers. So there are efferent nerve fibers that are the ones that go from the brain down the vagus nerve to the organs, giving information, vital information. And then 80% of the nerve fibers in the body go back up to the brain. So it's bidirectional. So the brain and the body are listening and communicating with each other. And we'll talk about how that plays out. So the vagus nerve has two main sides, has multiple branches. Each branch has different little sub branches, but there are two main sides, the dorsal and the ventral. And those are going to come into play in a moment. So this researcher, Stephen Porges, he's a psychologist and scientist, in the 1990s became really interested in how the vagus nerve can affect our nervous system and our emotional functioning. And so he developed this polyvagal theory, which looked at the fact that there are different branches that can be impacted, and we can actually impact the different branches. So you can see here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but the dorsal vagal pathway that involves what we call immobilization, and then the ventral vagal, which involves safety and connection. And in between that is the sympathetic nervous system. So that's not part of the vagus nerve, but it involves a part of the whole nervous system regulation. Okay, so this polyvagal theory is this biological theory about how as humans we need connection, and it's wired in. It's a survival response to have connection. And it's also part of the key to working on our nervous system regulation. So Porges talks about these evolutionary stages that happened in our autonomic nervous system. And so you can see the branches again. Parasympathetic is our relaxation response, and the sympathetic nervous system is our activation, our fight-flight response. Part of the parasympathetic has two branches, the dorsal and the ventral, okay? And so Porges talks about the earliest part of the vagus nerve was the dorsal vagal, the immobilization, the shutdown part of the brain. So if something's dangerous, we shut down, right? And then over time, the sympathetic nervous system evolved, and then finally the ventral vagal. So still we're talking 200 million years ago. So it's still relatively old in our evolution, but you can see it's kind of a primitive system that gets more complicated and more complex as we add in the socialization components. All right, so the heart of the polyvagal theory is this idea of neuroception. All the time, our brain, our nervous system, and the connections to the nervous system through the vagus nerve are looking at a situation and where it's always asking, am I safe or is it dangerous? Now, interestingly, this is happening at a pre-conscious level. So we're not even aware of it until it reaches our attention level. So it's kind of it's happening undetected or relatively undetected. And it can start with a feeling, like if you ever felt unsafe when you're walking on the street for some reason, right? Or when you immediately have a reaction to liking somebody or not liking somebody. Your brain has already done this little surveillance. It's happening already. By the time it gets to your active awareness, you've already had a reaction in your body. So this is really important to know. So we have this neuroception, which if we don't hone in on it, is just happening out of our preconscious level. Part of this whole process is to begin to tune in more and more to the early neuroceptive cues in our body to help us respond more effectively. So Porges talks about, in particular, the vagus nerve to help us with neuroception, because it does play a role in the threat detection system. So we have two sides of the vagus nerve, right? We're going to start first with the dorsal vagal at the bottom. The dorsal side responds to cues of danger. It pulls us away from connection from an evolutionary standpoint, right? We're wired this way. If something is very distressing to our system, we feel trapped, we shut down, we can feel despair, numb, hopeless. Our heart rate decreases. It doesn't increase, it decreases. So there's a shutdown that happens. So this is when there is extreme stress. In the middle is our sympathetic nervous system, our fight flight. And this is often when we feel that adrenaline racing, we get mobilized, right? And we might get activated, right? We start to get, distressed, but we don't always go into shutdown. So sympathetic is kind of the bridge in the middle. And then the ventral vagal is when we feel connected and grounded, resourced, we feel curious and open. Now notice all three of these, there can be stress levels at all three of these, right? It's how does our nervous system respond to the threat to our own being, right? So it could be the most stressful situation to one person, but if their nervous system's like, hey, this is great. I love doing this, then the person's likely to still be in a ventral vagal state. But if someone else feels like this could kill me, this is horrible, right? Then their system shuts it down, right? So it's the way that our nervous system's detecting it that really influences our actions, behaviors, and thoughts about it. So we're really learning how in our own system to figure out if there's a mismatch, right? Because you probably have had the situation where you have to go talk in front of an audience, right? And you know that these are an audience of people that like you, and likely nothing bad is going to happen. But your nervous system is like, oh my God, I don't even know what to say. I'm so anxious, right? And so that's like a mismatch. It's not really a dangerous situation, but our nervous system is acting as if it is, right? And so we want to bring first compassion to that, but also to help our nervous system to recognize what is actually happening, and then resource us to get back into a more balanced state. So there's always a dialogue between the dorsal vagal and the ventral vagal systems. And ideally, there's a bidirectional flow, right? So we're not trying to always be in this blissful ventral vagal, I'm chilled out, everything is good. But it's that we can have a flexibility, because in fact, I just want to go back briefly. In fact, we want to sometimes be in a fight, flight, or mobilization. We don't have to be in a full fight, flight. We want to get mobilized because it helps us. That adrenaline, you're about to be, go into a courtroom, or you're going to be in a difficult situation. You do need that extra. I'm leaning forward to kind of show you, like, we need that extra engagement so that we're focused, right? So the goal is to have this flexibility. We call it vagal tone, to be able to respond effectively to what the situation calls for, rather than this mismatch when the situation doesn't call for mobilization and we're overactivated. So when a threat has passed, let's say, for example, we're driving, someone cuts us off, we immediately get activated, mobilized, and then, that we don't hit the car, thankfully, and then we go back into our, like, okay, oof, that passed. We can go back to where we were before. But someone who's been in a car accident, for example, if someone cuts them off, they may have a shutdown. They may go into a dorsal vagal state because it reenacts a trauma for them, and they may not be able to continue driving. They have to pull off the side of the road because their system got so overwhelmed. So danger cues, especially for someone who's had trauma, can create this shutdown in situations that it's dangerous to have a shutdown while you're driving, but also in situations where, okay, the danger is past, but my nervous system is still way overactivated, right? And that can affect our decision making and how we respond in high stress situations, which we're going to get to in a moment. So overall, this polyvagal theory can help us understand our nervous system with more compassion and empathy, and also to be able to give us some tools so that when we start to notice, oh, I'm getting really activated, okay, I know I need to use some tools, which we're going to talk about. So essentially, when we're talking about tools from a polyvagal perspective, we're going to be talking about physical, emotional, and then also this interpersonal piece, right? Because as we talked about earlier, the ventral vagal nervous system is really about social connection and feeling safe with another person or other people. All right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Stacy now. We will return to the polyvagal theory at the end to talk about now applying it and some tools. Okay, thanks, Stacy.
Thank you, Tracy. So we're looking at integrating this understanding of our nervous system with where we are at various stages in the practice. So if we were looking at the opening slide in the green, this would be sort of that space where you can anticipate that there are things that will come up. You understand sort of your ethical duties and responsibilities, and now you have to prepare and recognize that you have to have hard conversations. And what's interesting here is to think about, how do I feel? What's coming up for me when I'm about to have this conversation with a particular person? This allows you to think about yourself. but it also allows you to think about with some curiosity and empathy and understanding about the other person or the partner with whom you're going to have this conversation, and prepare. So, Tracy talked about the space between thoughts and feelings. Some of you may have heard of the thought model that circumstances create thoughts, thoughts create feelings, and those create reactions and responses. And understanding where the polyvagal theory and your nervous system fits in helps you to manage that space better. And you realize that you still have to set boundaries. And then, though, you have the ability, the awareness to implement productive strategies to ensure that you stay within the ethical boundaries and the relationship is successful. As we sort of move down the ethical funnel into difficulty, now you are facing a threat of unethical conduct or violating your ethical responsibilities. And even as I'm saying that, I feel reactivity in my body. I feel it in my chest. I feel it in my shoulders. I am aware that there is stress. And when I'm in that state, my capacity to think is narrowed. My capacity to make choices is narrow. So then again, practicing about knowing what your triggers are and using the tool of seeking guidance and getting clarity. There's Office of Bar Counsel has an ethical hotline. We can help you here to, think through and talk through some issues that you may be having interpersonally and with your ethical obligations to sort of guide you to resources. And again, practicing to have productive strategies for when X happens, I'm going to do Y, which may include box breathing so that you can be prepared to do Y. And the last sort of most intense area is the red. Nobody wants to get the letter from the BBO that says personal and confidential, because that means somebody has reported the lawyer, or even if you don't get reported, the idea that an ethical violation occurs for some of us is like strict liability. We're in the red. We can't think. We go into our historical ways of dealing with that kind of stress, which is to not respond, to get angry, to sort of, come forward with aggression. But again, if you practice and learn to have hard conversations of, okay, this happened, and recognizing what your role is, the ability to take responsibility if there is an interaction with a third party, and then an ability to thoughtfully problem solve about what a good and appropriate outcome is from the perspective of this polyvagal, the state, the green state, where you're actually able to engage with the difficulty with your full mind. And so I think now we're going to turn to an activating scenario. And we came up with the scenario. It's both timely, but it is also activating as an area of the practice where there can be a lot of trauma and a lot of complaints. So I see we're running short on time. Hopefully you all can read this. It's an immigration situation with a client from El Salvador. The government claims that the client is a member of the MS-13, infamous MS-13 gang. And their basis for saying this is that the client is seen wearing known gang clothing, which includes a black hoodie. And as you're in court and you're imagining the situation, and I want us to sort of visualize that so we can get the full sense of what this is. As you're in court, you're standing there with your client, and the judge is in front of you, and the government is making these arguments. And before turning to you, the judge remarks something that suggests that the judge is aware that your client may in fact be a gang member because of this argument. I think we want to, at this point, Tracy, I'm going to turn it back over to you to sort of guide us through the exercise,
Yeah.
and then do the practice and then finish up.
So as you've heard about that scenario, you might have even noticed some activation. And I want you to kind of stay with that for a moment if you can, and think about what came up, and maybe even go inside for a moment and just notice where your nervous system went to. Thinking about this court situation, you're the attorney. And just notice. Do you notice there's mobilization? Is there a shutdown? Do you feel safe and connected? Do you notice some of that early fight, flight, freeze going on in your nervous system without judging, just noticing if there are thoughts and feelings, beliefs that are coming up? And now we're going to do a practice which does involve some breathing. It involves coherent breathing. And I'm going to invite you to sit comfortably. I'm going to let go of that scenario now. And just closing your eyes if you're able, or if you're not able, then just lowering your gaze or maybe looking away from the screen. And taking a few deep, relaxing breaths. And seeing if you can soften the muscles around your eyes, your eyebrows and forehead. And softening your mouth, jaw, neck and shoulders. Softening your arms and hands. Softening all the muscles from the top of your spine all the way down your back. Softening the muscles of your chest and belly, your upper legs and lower legs, your whole body. We're going to begin to slow down our breath by counting. So I'll count. You're able to close your mouth and breathe in and out through your nose. And do it that way. If you can't, it's okay to breathe out through your mouth. Just going to move the air in slowly and gently without forcing or straining. So no need to overfill the lungs, or no need to push the air all the way out. So I'll begin by counting to 3, and then I'll extend it to 4. So we'll count into a breath of 3 and then out 3, and then eventually to 4 and 4. If you have trouble keeping the 4 and 4, then just breathe to a count of 3 and 3. So let's begin. Breathing in, 2, 3. Breathing out, 2, 3. Breath in, 2, 3. Breath out, 2, 3. Breathing into 4, 2, 3, 4. Breath out, 2, 3, 4. Breathing in, 2, 3, 4. Breathing out, 2, 3, 4. Gently in, 2, 3, 4. Softly out, 2, 3, 4. Breath in, 2, 3, 4. Breath out, 2, 3, 4. Softening your body with each breath in, 2, 3, 4. Relaxing as you breathe out, 2, 3, 4. We'll do 2 more rounds. Breath in, 2, 3, 4. Breath out, 2, 3, 4. And then very gently stopping the counting, just beginning to find a natural rhythm of your breath. You may notice you are still breathing in the coherent breathing fashion, which is just a sign you're training your breath. And when you're ready, I'm going to invite you to open your eyes and come back. And just notice how you feel. Notice if there are any shifts in your body. We're going to come back to our scenario in a moment now. And we're going to invite you to think about the same situation again after this coherent breathing. And notice what's happening in your body. Notice if there are any shifts in how you feel and even how you would respond. And we really were curious to hear from anyone who's willing to put in chat about after the practice, what you noticed and if it would have affected how you would have handled the situation as the attorney, right? So I'd love to hear from some of you. So I see someone said less visceral anger. Yeah, yeah. And so each of these changes that we notice in our system can influence how we respond. Anyone else notice a change? Or you don't have to have a change either, but what else did you notice after? More confidence that I can handle the issue. Yeah. So that goes to what Taylor's saying, goes into a belief system too, right? How we feel more confident, more secure. I feel like I could be far more reasoned the second time. Interesting, right? So reason, confidence. Yes. Eleanor says, I give the same response, but in a less snarky tone, right? And that is really important. The tone of voice, right? Because other people respond to how we say things. Yeah. Michelle says, noticed a wiser mind. And that goes to that prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that can really help us in difficult situations to make a good decision, which involves our perspective taking, problem solving skills. And I'll show you in a moment exactly what all of you said is what happens when we do coherent breathing. Yeah, great. Okay, so these are really helpful. So we're going to show you now a little bit of like what happened during that practice. So this is sort of what we were talking about. When we do a polyvagal tool, and there are multiple tools, so box breathing or coherent breathing are not the only ones, but think about polyvagal tools are like a brake. And if we're driving and there's traffic, we don't want to slam the brake on, and we also want to be able to take the brake off so we can move again. So what we're talking about is essentially using tools like a brake system. We want to mobilize when we need to mobilize, but we want to be able to move between action and calm. And that's what lawyers have to do all the time, right? So we want to access and use our resources. We want a little bit of mobilization, right? If we're setting a boundary where we're really trying to be firm, but our tone of voice can get impacted by how our vagus nerve is activated, right? So we're going to be using tools as this sort of braking system. All right, so I'm going to show you a little bit more. So breathing tools, and we have other tools, and again, in that previous presentation, you can see a little bit more about that. But breathing has this involuntary and voluntary component. Involuntary because we do breathe without thinking about it, but voluntary because we can change our breath patterns. And by changing our breath pattern, it changes that bidirectional information going in and out of the brain. The brain listens to the lungs, and the lungs listen to the brain, to say it really simply. So that is why we can actually change how we're thinking and feeling by changing our breathing. It sounds so simple, I know, but if you think about what we're talking about today, it's a complex nervous system, but the breathing is a doorway. It's one of the simplest ways to activate both our mobilization and also our parasympathetic nervous system. So essentially, we can use a breath map and know where we are in our vagus nervous system, our polyvagal theory. We can apply it. If we're breathing like sharp and focused, we are in a sympathetic arousal, right? If our ventral vagal system is online, we're breathing easily. We might not even be thinking about our breath, but we're taking long, slow breaths. We're breathing easily. We can talk and smile. We're not getting out of breath. And if we're in a real shutdown, immobilization, we may feel like shallow breath, quiet. We're not even really breathing well. And you can notice this with your clients or the opposing counsel. Where are they? You can imagine this breath map almost like transposed on each person. Where are they in there? What's happening in their nervous system? So breathing gives us this sort of window inside to what's happening within us and also within the people we're working with. And so we can use, Stacy said this really beautifully before, we can use our own knowledge to help other people, right, that are maybe struggling like our clients. So coherent breathing or paced breathing is really helpful because it does bring balance to the autonomic nervous system. And why does it do that? This is just what we were doing, right? Breathing in and out, slowing the breath down. So these are all the things that happen when we do slow diaphragmatic breathing. It can lower blood pressure. It helps with heart rate variability, can decrease our pain response, etc. So essentially, it also emotionally can help us soothe and relax, getting us more likely into that ventral vagal state. It reduces overactivity. Some of you commented on this, like a wiser mind, right? A less snarky tone. I have more capability, less impulsive, right? I can be more calm, right? It can help us regulate emotions. And then we also think better. And this goes directly to what Stacy was talking about when we're thinking about how to respond, right? Do we just shut down and not respond? Or do we begin to use our reasoning, our prefrontal cortex? So paced breathing helps us increase activity in the prefrontal cortex. That's why, although it sounds so simple, we actually really do want to do breathing to help us think better. And that helps us with alertness, attention, and focus. And so after the polyvagal practice, again, we talked about what changes and did you notice? Because we're not talking about just physiological changes. We're talking about changes in our thoughts, feelings, and maybe even our beliefs, right? That, instead of I can't handle this judge is XYZ, something terrible is going to happen, right? Where our beliefs can, some well-honed, even trauma responses can happen. It helps us to be able to see there are alternatives. We're more flexible and nimble in our belief system as well. And so we talked about how this would impact you and how you would respond, right? All right, so that is the presentation. We want to save time now for questions and hear from you about some of the material. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides. Stacy, we did it. We got through it. We were very worried.
We did.
Yes.
And as the questions are coming in, I see one. I want to sort of say, like, as an athlete, and as whenever I'm getting ready to do so, some know that I powerlift. And one of the exercises that my coach taught me was this sort of breathing that would get me into that sort of excited state, right? To increase the adrenaline, sort of like you see the shows where the mother and the child is under the car and the mother lifts the car, right? Like that's the idea. And so it's just another example of how we can use breathing to create a state that is helpful to us.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. The sympathetic arousal is important. So we're not always trying to, and I love that flexibility. Sometimes we do need to be able to proverbially lift the car up. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are two questions here. One, the first question is, who came up with the polyvagal theory? I think you have a quick response to that. And are there additional resources and books that we can read to learn more about this? So I'll let you take that first.
Sure. Yeah. So Stephen Porges is the creator of the polyvagal theory. He has multiple books. And in the earlier February webinar, I have a whole list of resources on the last part of the slides. So, but Stephen Porges, and then a psychologist that has worked with him, her name is Deb Dana, has a couple of books about quick strategies. So box breathings, that breath chart, she has something similar in her book. There's a whole sound. It's called Safe and Sound Protocol, where there are tools where you can listen to different sounds, and that can help stimulate the ventral vagal nervous system state. So there are lots of different tools, but Stephen Porges is the person you want to look up, and you can see some specific links. He does many podcasts and discussions around it, and he has several books.
And then there's another question, what could an alternative belief be? And I think that may be in reference to the scenario. And I'll sort of jump in with another book that I've enjoyed from author Amishi Jha, Peak Mind. And one of the things she talks about is sort of 12 minutes a day, but she also has some very specific practices which sort of segues into answering this question, which is sort of what alternative belief could there be? And I think, so one of her practices is that this person that is caused, that sort of when in the interaction we have great stress and conflict with, is recognizing, wanting ease for them, because recognizing that they want sort of the same things that we want, and sort of being able to look at what else might be happening. And so in a situation like the scenario where you have the immigration judge, make some kind of comment, and thinking about sort of the narrowing of the thought process, right? Like there's an activation of like, are you serious? Did you just say that this person is a gang member because they have a black hoodie? We can go right at that and fight, or we can take a step back and think about what misunderstanding that this judge is having, a misunderstanding of the circumstances of when said client wears a black hoodie, if the client ever does wear a black hoodie, and how what what gang colors really are. So this is sort of a bonding of our own intellectual knowledge and beliefs, but being able to take a step back, and instead of seeing it as an aggressive act by the judge, see it as an opportunity to educate and realize that the judge doesn't really understand. And so what can I say that might be helpful? But if I'm seeing red, I can't think that, and then I can't actualize and operate on that. So I need to be able to figure out what I'm hearing that would be different.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sounds True has Deb Dana. Yes, that's great. She is fantastic. So thank you for sharing that. And there's a lot of free resources on YouTube and with Stephen and but Deb is like she's like the goddess of techniques. So that's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that what we're hoping for in this kind of introduction is really the idea that we can start detecting, like we don't have to know all the tools yet, but just to understand when we are activated, it's not that we're doing something wrong or we just don't have the skill set. We can have a deep appreciation for our poor, sometimes I say our poor nervous system, right? Especially for lawyers these days, that how much activation and your vagus nerve is giving all of this input to your brain. There's a lot of reactivity that's happening in our bodies. And, once we start to be able to notice that with compassion and interest, then we have many more tools that we can start to apply. Right. So the first step is just to get informed, like you all are doing, understand how this might impact your everyday, responses, not just in the workplace, but also with our relationships and just how we even talk to ourselves. And then begin to explore different tools, because these tools, there's many different ones, and that could be, we'll continue to offer different ideas as well at LCL.
And I just want to add to that, there's a book by Byron Katie called Loving What Is. And one of her questions, she talks about this work. She's got these 4 questions. And is it true? I say that to think about our beliefs don't have to be fixed. And so being able to think about this thing, this way that I feel on a regular basis, identifying those, and then spending time when we're not in that stress, sort of unpacking that along with these practices creates creates more space, so that when we are in a similar circumstance, we can say, oh, I recognize that. And now I'm in the position to listen more. I see we have one more comment, and we've got just a moment, and I see that the comment is about appreciating the idea of breathing as a gateway into our nervous system.
That's a great, yeah.
Way to, yes, I think a great takeaway. And a great way to end. Amy, I'm going to turn it back over to you for any further housekeeping. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you both, Tracy and Stacy. It was an absolute wonderful presentation. And just to let people know that, yes, you will receive a recording of this presentation as well as the actual slides. We'll include a list of the books that Tracy and Stacy mentioned, so you can refer back to those. And really, thank you both again. This was wonderful, and it sounds like we're getting some great feedback on the comments. So Lots of thank yous and appreciations.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.